The road to the mountain had no mercy for a woman riding alone, and Alice no longer cared. By the time the gates of the old keep rose out of the mist, her hands had gone numb around the reins, and the cloak her stepmother once called unbecoming for a lady was soaked through at the shoulders. She didn't slow the horse. She didn't look back at the valley behind her, where smoke from her father's hearth still rose into a sky that no longer felt like home. She had left that house a daughter. She would arrive at this one something else entirely. She didn't yet have the word for it. Widowed before marriage, maybe. Orphaned twice. A woman who had buried her father 3 weeks ago and learned, 4 nights ago, that grief was the least of what they intended to take from her. She had not planned to come here. 2 days ago, she would have laughed at the idea. Riding alone, unescorted, no dowry chest, no betrothal contract, straight to the gates of a king the rest of the territory spoke of only in lowered voices. The Alpha King who kept no court, who answered no summons, who had buried his own losses so deep that no one alive could say what had carved the scar along his jaw. Only that he wore it the way other men wore crowns, without explanation, without apology. She hadn't planned any of this. But 4 nights ago, she had stood outside her father's old study with a candle going soft in her fingers, and she had heard her uncle's voice through the door, low and pleased, saying her name the way a man says the name of something he has already decided to sell. 3 weeks, he'd said. 3 weeks until the mourning period ends, and the will reads properly. After that, the girl is a problem we solve quietly. No one questions a grieving woman who wanders off a cliff path at night. She had not screamed. She had not dropped the candle. She had stood very still, the way her father had taught her to stand still when something dangerous was close enough to smell fear. And she had listened to her stepmother's soft laugh agree with him, and to a third voice, her cousin's husband, a magistrate's clerk with soft hands and a softer conscience, promised that the falsified accounts would hold up under any inquiry, that the western pastures and the timber rights and the silver that had taken her father 30 years to earn would pass cleanly into hands that were not hers. She had walked back to her room on legs she did not trust, packed nothing but a blade her father once used for skinning game, and the deed papers she'd stolen from his locked drawer, and waited 2 more days, smiling at breakfast, accepting condolences, letting her stepmother braid flowers into hair she was already planning to disappear with. She had needed those 2 days. She had needed to be certain there was no rescue coming from inside that house, no uncle who might still love her enough to stop, no stepmother whose cruelty had a floor. There wasn't. There never had been. So on the 3rd night, while the household slept off the wine from a memorial dinner held in her father's honor, his name toasted by the very mouths planning to erase his daughter, Alice had taken the gelding nobody watched closely anymore, and she had ridden north, into territory where her family's name meant nothing and her face meant less, toward the one power in the region with no debt to her uncle, no friendship with her stepmother's family, no reason at all to hand her quietly back to people who wanted her dead. She knew what they said about him in the lowland villages, that he had taken the crown from a father who didn't deserve to keep it, that something had happened in the Eastern Wars that left him with no taste for courts or councils or company, that he had not taken a wife, not received a delegation, not so much as attended a border treaty signing in 3 years. Men who asked too many questions about the Alpha King tended to get answers that ended the conversation rather than satisfied it. It didn't matter. He was the only name in the region whose hands her uncle could not buy. The gates were iron and old growth wood, banded with metal gone dark from weather, and the 2 guards posted there did not so much as reach for their blades when she reined in before them. They simply stared, because a woman riding alone, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, asking by name for an audience with the king, was not a thing that happened in that place. Not ever. "Tell him," Alice said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "that the king will want to hear what I have to say before he decides whether to send me away." They sent for someone. She waited in the cold, with her spine straight and her hands folded over the saddle horn, because she had learned, in 23 years of being underestimated, that the moment you let your shoulders fall, people stopped listening. She was led, eventually, not into some grand receiving hall, but into a long room lined floor to ceiling with books, candlelight pooling gold across leather spines and old maps weighted down with brass instruments, papers scattered across a desk that looked worked rather than decorative. The fire had burned low. The room smelled of pine smoke, old paper, and something colder underneath. Iron, maybe, or the particular silence of a place that had not heard laughter in a long time. He was standing when she entered, as though he'd been pacing, or as though stillness simply wasn't natural to him even at rest. Dark hair pulled back in long, plaited rows. A fur-lined cloak settled over leather worn soft at the seams from use rather than vanity. Forearms wrapped in scarred leather guards that had clearly seen things she didn't want described to her. A thin scar crossed one cheekbone, old and pale. His eyes found her the instant she crossed the threshold, and they did not move away. Not assessing her like the men at her stepmother's dinners assessed a marriageable face, but reading her, the way a man reads weather before a storm, calculating what kind of trouble had just walked through his door. "You asked for an audience," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of someone who had stopped wasting words a long time ago. "You didn't say why." Alice felt the cold of the ride settle into her bones now that she'd stopped moving, felt the exhaustion threaten to buckle something in her chest she'd been holding rigid for 4 days. She did not let it show. "My name is Alice," she said. "My father held the Western Valley lands until 3 weeks ago, when he died and left them to me. My family is currently arranging to have me killed before the will can be read in full, so that the inheritance passes to people who are not entitled to it." She let that settle, watched something shift behind his eyes. Not shock, exactly. Attention. "I am not here to ask for shelter, Your Grace. I'm here to propose a marriage, to you. Tonight, if you're willing to hear the terms before you say no." The fire cracked in the silence that followed. Somewhere above them, wind moved against old glass. Orion did not laugh, did not scoff, did not do any of the things she had braced herself to weather on the long ride north. He simply studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her aware of every mile of mud on her boots, every hour of sleep she hadn't had, the steadiness she was holding together by will alone. "You rode here alone," he said finally. Not a question. "I had no one left to bring." Something flickered across his face then, gone before she could name it, but she would remember, much later, that it had looked almost like recognition. Like he knew exactly what it cost a person to arrive somewhere with nothing but the truth, and a blade meant for skinning game. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair near the dying fire, "before you fall down and make this decision for both of us." She sat. And for the first time in 4 days, Alice let herself breathe. The chair was harder than it looked, but Alice had sat through worse. Years of her stepmother's dinners, stiff-backed and silent while strangers picked apart her prospects like merchants haggling over livestock. This was different. This time she had chosen the table. Orion didn't sit across from her. He moved instead to the hearth, crouching to feed another log into the dying fire, and the gesture struck her as strange. A king tending his own flame rather than calling a servant to do it. When he rose again, the firelight caught the scar along his jaw, and for a moment he looked less like a ruler and more like a man who had simply run out of patience for the formalities that came with the title. "Terms," he said, settling into the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could see the tiredness etched permanently beneath his eyes. Not from the hour, she suspected, but from years of it. "You said you came to propose terms." "I'm listening." Alice folded her hands in her lap to stop them from trembling, though she doubted he hadn't already noticed. Shifters noticed everything. She knew that much, even living half a county away from werewolf affairs her whole life. The scent of fear, the pace of a heartbeat, the particular exhaustion that came from riding through 2 nights without rest. "My father's lands border the river crossing at Ashgate," she said. 3 valleys, 2 mills, the timber rights along the northern ridge, and enough silver in the family accounts to matter to anyone patient enough to wait for me to disappear. My uncle has already falsified the inheritance papers. He has a magistrate's clerk willing to swear the accounts are clean. In 18 days, when the mourning period ends and the will is read before the regional court, he intends for me to already be dead. An accident, a fall, something that draws no questions because grieving women do foolish, fatal things all the time. No one will look twice. She made herself say it plainly, without the tremor that wanted to creep into her voice. She had practiced this on the ride north, over and over, until the words stopped feeling like her own devastation and started feeling like a report. A king did not want a weeping girl. A king wanted information he could use. "If I marry into a house with no debt to my family and no reason to honor my uncle's claims," she continued, "the inheritance transfers with me, not to him. The lands, the silver, the timber rights, they become the property of my husband's house the moment the contract is signed, regardless of what happens to me afterward. My uncle's entire plan depends on me staying unmarried and isolated until the will reads. If I marry first, and marry into power he cannot challenge, his claim dies before it's ever filed." Orion's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened, the focused quiet of a man turning a problem over from every angle before he spoke. "You're not asking me for protection," he said slowly. "You're offering me your father's entire holding in exchange for my name." "I'm offering you a fair trade," Alice corrected. 3 valleys, 2 mills, full timber rights on the northern ridge, and silver enough to fund a garrison for a decade, in exchange for a marriage that costs you almost nothing. I don't require affection, Your Grace. I don't require attention. I require a signature, a contract witnessed by someone my uncle cannot bribe or intimidate, and the protection that comes from being a woman no longer alone in the world. You keep your isolation. I keep my life. Everyone profits except the men currently planning my funeral." For a long moment he said nothing. The fire popped and settled. Somewhere in the keep, a door closed at a distance, and a draft moved through the room, stirring the maps on his desk. "You've thought this through carefully," he said finally, "for someone who arrived here 4 days after burying her father." "I had nothing else to do while I rode," Alice said. "Grief makes excellent company for arithmetic." Something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. There and gone so quickly she might have invented it. He stood again, pacing once toward the window, where rain had started against the old glass, and Alice watched the line of his shoulders, the careful, contained way he moved. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. Even his silence felt deliberate, like a man choosing his words the way other men chose weapons. "You understand what people will say," he said, his back still to her. "That I bought a dead man's lands with my name. That you sold yourself to a king who hasn't left this mountain in 3 years because he couldn't stomach one more court, one more council, one more room full of people who wanted something from him. They'll say you're either very desperate or very clever, and they won't bother deciding which, because both make for better gossip than the truth." "Let them talk," Alice said. "I've spent my whole life being talked about by people who never once asked what I actually wanted. I stopped caring what story they tell themselves a long time ago." He turned to look at her then, and the look lasted longer than the others had. Searching, unhurried, the kind of attention that made her feel, oddly, less like a stranger arguing for her life, and more like someone being actually seen, maybe for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. "What happened to your father?" he asked. Quieter now. Not part of the negotiation. Something else. Alice's composure cracked, Just slightly, just enough that she had to look down at her folded hands before she answered. A fever. Fast. 3 weeks ago, he was riding the northern fence line checking storm damage, and 12 days later, he was gone. My stepmother said it was a mercy he didn't suffer long. I think now she was relieved he didn't suffer long enough to change his will. You think she knew? Before he died? I think, Alice said carefully, that grief makes people careless about hiding their relief. I started watching the way she spoke to my uncle 3 days before the funeral was even arranged. I should have run sooner. I didn't believe people I'd shared a table with for 9 years could plan to put me in the ground for a handful of silver and timber rights. Orion was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something rougher, lower. Not anger directed at her, but something old and contained finally pulling at its leash. I know what it is, he said, to share a roof with people who smile at your face and plan around your absence. I had family once who did the same, before the crown came to me instead of them. Greed doesn't care about blood. It never has. It was the most personal thing he'd said since she'd walked through his door, and Alice understood somehow that it had cost him something to say it. That whatever had put that scar on his jaw, and that particular exhaustion behind his eyes, wasn't a story he handed out freely to strangers who arrived uninvited at midnight with a marriage proposal in their mouths. Then you understand why I came here instead of to any of the lowland houses, she said. They all have ties to my uncle's circle. A favor owed, a daughter married into his allies, a debt from some old border dispute. You have none of that. You have no reason to protect his interests. And apparently, she added, with a flicker of dry honesty she couldn't quite suppress, no patience left for company you didn't choose, which makes you the safest stranger in this entire territory for a woman in my position. Flattering, Orion said, and there was something almost wry in it now, a crack of dark humor in all that careful stillness. I didn't ride 2 days to flatter you, Your Grace. I rode 2 days because you were the only name on the map that didn't make my chest go tight with fear when I thought about it. That seemed to land somewhere real. He studied her a while longer. Not the assessing stare of a man pricing a transaction, she realized, but something closer to a man recalibrating an assumption he'd walked into the room holding. Whatever he'd expected when the guards announced a lone woman demanding audience at this hour, it hadn't been this. A clear-eyed accounting of betrayal and arithmetic, delivered without tears, by someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days and had decided to negotiate for her life anyway, rather than beg for it. There are conditions, he said finally, returning to the chair across from her. If I agree to this. Alice straightened. I'm listening. The marriage is real, in every legal sense, witnessed, filed, unchallengeable. Your uncle will find no thread to pull at. But I won't pretend to you what it isn't. I have no court left to speak of, because I dismissed most of it years ago. I keep this keep with a skeleton staff, a small guard, and very little patience for politics. If you marry me, you marry into quiet. Into a mountain most people are afraid to visit. You won't be paraded as a trophy bride through lowland halls, because I don't attend those halls anymore. Is that acceptable to you? More than acceptable, Alice said, and meant it. The idea of disappearing into somewhere her uncle's reach couldn't easily follow sounded less like exile, and more like the first safe breath she'd taken in weeks. Second, Orion continued, I will not ask anything of you beyond what's written in the contract. No expectation of affection, as you said. No performance of a marriage neither of us asked for emotionally. You'll have your own rooms, your own time, your own decisions about how much of yourself you choose to share in this house, if any. I won't crowd what isn't offered freely. Something in Alice's chest loosened slightly at that, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying, the old fear of being handed from one set of expectations to another, one set of hands closing around her life in a different shape. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant that too. Third, his voice shifted again, lower, more deliberate. "Whoever did this to your father, whoever is planning to do it to you, I won't let that stand simply because the marriage protects the land. A contract stops the inheritance theft. It doesn't undo what they intended. If you want justice for what they tried to do to you, I have resources your uncle has never had to reckon with. Soldiers. Influence the lowland courts can't ignore, however much they'd like to. That's not part of the trade you proposed. That's something I'm offering separately, because I find I have very little tolerance left for men who murder grieving women over silver." Alice looked at him for a long moment, and something in her throat tightened that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She had ridden north expecting, at best, a transaction, a cold exchange of land for safety, conducted by a king too isolated to care much either way. She had not expected this. An offer of justice she hadn't even had the strength yet to ask for herself. "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "You don't know me. You have no reason to care what happens to my uncle beyond the contract." Orion's jaw tightened, just slightly, and when he answered, his voice had gone quiet in a way that felt heavier than anger. "Because I know exactly what it looks like when family decides someone's life is worth less than what they'll inherit from it. I watched it happen once and arrived too late to stop the worst of it. I don't intend to make that mistake twice, even for a marriage that started as a piece of paper." The fire had burned down to embers by the time they finished, rain still drumming steady against old glass, and somewhere in the long quiet that followed, Alice realized she had stopped bracing for the conversation to turn cruel. It hadn't. It had simply ended, plainly, the way a fair negotiation ends, with both parties having said what needed saying, and neither one pretending it was something softer than it was. "I'll have the contract drawn before morning," Orion said, rising. "You'll want to read every line yourself before you sign anything. I won't be insulted if you trust nothing I put in front of you. Trust isn't something either of us owes the other yet." "No," Alice agreed, standing as well, her legs finally steady beneath her for the first time since she'd left her father's house. "But I appreciate that you understand that, instead of expecting it for free." He studied her once more, that same unhurried reading look, like he was filing away something he hadn't expected to find in a woman who'd arrived soaked through and half frozen with a stranger's name on her tongue and a death sentence at her back. "There's a room being prepared," he said. "You'll sleep first. We'll deal with contracts, and your uncle and everything else waiting outside these walls once you've had more than 4 hours of rest in 4 days. That's not negotiable, before you try." For the first time since the candle had gone soft in her fingers outside her father's study door, Alice felt something in her chest unclench enough to almost resemble relief. "I wasn't going to argue," she said. "Good," Orion said. "You'll need the strength. What's coming for your uncle won't be quiet, and I intend for you to be standing when it arrives." The contract arrived before dawn, written in a clerk's careful hand, and sealed with wax that smelled faintly of the same pine smoke that clung to the rest of the keep. Alice read every line twice, the way Orion had told her to, sitting at a narrow desk in the room they'd given her. Small but warm, a fire already lit, a basin of water still steaming when she'd woken. She found nothing hidden in the language, no clause that quietly stripped her of the lands once the ink dried. No fine print designed to make her regret riding north. It was, exactly as promised, plain and fair. Her father's holdings transferred into the Union, her name attached to his as equal signatories. No claim her uncle could legally contest once it was filed before a magistrate her uncle's clerk had no authority over. She signed it with a hand that barely shook. Orion signed beside her without ceremony, without witnesses beyond 2 of his household guard and an elderly steward who'd served the keep. She gathered, since before the scar on the king's jaw existed. There was no celebration afterward, no toast, no gathered court. No performance of joy neither of them was required to fake. He simply rolled the contract, sealed it again, and handed it to the steward with instructions to have it filed with the regional magistrate by the fastest rider available, before her uncle's people had any reason to suspect she'd left the valley at all. "It's done," Orion said, once the steward had gone. "Whatever happens next, the lands are no longer his to take." Alice should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, the way a held breath feels once it's finally released, relief tangled with something closer to grief, because the contract was proof, in ink and wax, that the family she'd grown up beneath truly hadn't loved her at all. Not enough to overrule 3 weeks of greed. Not enough to stop a man from speaking her death so casually through a closed door. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself, somewhere on the second night of the ride north, that she'd done enough crying for people who didn't deserve the tears. Word of the marriage reached the valley within 4 days, carried by a merchant's gossip, and confirmed soon after by the magistrate's own seal on filed documents that named Alice. Not her uncle, not her stepmother, not the clerk with his falsified accounts, as the sole legal heir to her father's estate, now bound by marriage to the Alpha King of the Northern Territory. Alice imagined more than once what that moment must have looked like in her uncle's study. She pictured the color draining from his face as the messenger read the filing aloud. She pictured her stepmother's careful composure cracking for just a moment before resetting into something colder. She would never know exactly how the news landed, because she wasn't there to see it. But she understood, with a clarity that settled into her stomach like a stone, that men who built their entire plan around her death did not simply accept defeat and walk away. Men like her uncle didn't lose gracefully. They escalated. The first sign came 11 days later, delivered by one of Orion's scouts who patrolled the southern border where his territory met the lowland roads. A rider had been seen circling the keep's outer fence line twice in 2 days, never approaching, never announcing himself, just watching, the way a man watches a building he intends to return to with worse intentions. "Your uncle's man," Orion said, laying a small sketch the scout had made across the desk between them. The likeness was rough, but unmistakable to Alice. She recognized the heavy jaw, the particular way the man wore his collar too high. A steward who'd worked under her uncle for years and had never once looked her in the eye at dinner. "He's confirming you're actually here, actually married, actually beyond his reach the easy way. And once he confirms it, then your uncle decides whether to accept that he's lost the lands, or whether he tries something considerably more reckless to take back what the law no longer allows him to claim." Orion's voice had gone flat, and the particular way she was learning meant he was containing something sharper underneath. Men who plan murder over inheritance rarely have the patience to simply lose. Alice felt the cold of that truth settle through her, but she didn't flinch from it the way the old version of herself, the daughter who'd smiled through memorial toasts while plotting her own escape, might have. She'd had 11 days now in this quiet mountain keep to remember what it felt like to sleep without listening for footsteps outside her door. 11 days of meals that weren't poisoned with someone else's barely hidden impatience for her absence. She wasn't going back to being afraid, simply because the danger had a face again. "What do we do?" she asked. "We wait for him to make the next move," Orion said. "And we make certain that when he does, he finds out exactly how much he underestimated what marrying you actually cost him." The next move came not as violence, but as a letter, delivered to the keep's gate 8 days after the scout's sighting, sealed with her uncle's own crest, addressed to Alice by name and handwriting. She recognized instantly the careful, controlled penmanship of a man who had spent her entire childhood performing affection he never felt. She read it alone in her room first, before bringing it to Orion, because some part of her needed to absorb the cruelty privately before she let anyone else see how deeply old wounds could still cut even now. Even safe, even married into a power her uncle couldn't touch. Alice, it began, with none of the warmth the word implied. Your father, may his memory be honored, would be devastated to see how quickly grief drove you to such a reckless arrangement. A marriage to a man none of us have ever met, conducted in secret, without family present. Surely you understand how this looks to those who loved your father and worry for your well-being. We do not blame you for your judgment in this dark hour. Grief makes fools of even sensible women. However, I must inform you that questions have arisen regarding the legitimacy of a marriage entered into during active mourning, conducted without the consent or knowledge of your remaining family, to a man whose own claim to his title has, shall we say, been the subject of some debate in certain circles. I have engaged counsel to explore whether the marriage, and the transfer of your father's estate that came with it, might be challenged before the regional council on grounds of undue influence and the unsound state of mind that often follows sudden bereavement. This need not become ugly, Alice. Return home. Cooperate with a reasonable settlement regarding the estate. And we can resolve this quietly, as a family should, without dragging your name, or your husband's, through a council inquiry that neither of you would enjoy. Your loving uncle. Alice's hands had gone cold by the time she finished reading. Not from fear exactly, but from a fury so precise it felt almost clean. He hadn't bothered denying what he'd planned. He hadn't pretended remorse for the conversation she'd overheard through that study door. He had simply pivoted, from murder to litigation, from a quiet death on a cliff path, to a courtroom strategy designed to paint her as a grieving woman too unstable to make her own decisions, too easily influenced to have her marriage taken seriously. It was, she realized, a different kind of erasure. Just as deliberate, just as cold. She brought the letter to Orion in his study and watched his expression shift as he read it. The careful stillness she'd come to recognize, sharpening into something colder, more focused. The look of a man calculating exactly how far an enemy intended to go, and adjusting his own plans accordingly. He's not coming for the land directly anymore, Orion said, setting the letter down with deliberate care, as though handling it roughly might somehow give it more power than it deserved. He's coming for your credibility. If he can convince a council that you weren't capable of sound judgment when you signed that contract, grief, trauma, undue influence from a stranger you married within days of meeting, he doesn't need to kill you. He just needs to make the marriage itself look invalid. Can he do that? Alice asked, and hated how small her voice sounded asking it. He can try, Orion said. Whether he succeeds depends entirely on what evidence exists beyond his word against yours. Right now, it's an accusation. If he files it formally, it becomes a council matter, which means it becomes public, which means every detail of your father's death, the falsified accounts, the conversation you overheard, all of it gets dragged into daylight where a council can examine it properly. His eyes met hers, steady, deliberate. That terrifies him more than it should terrify you, Alice. A man confident in his innocence doesn't open with a quiet letter offering to settle. He opens with one because he's hoping you're still afraid enough of him to take the smaller humiliation instead of the larger fight. Alice sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resolve sharpening into focus. She thought of her father's voice. The way he used to speak about fairness at the dinner table before illness made him too tired to argue with a household that had already begun circling him like vultures who simply hadn't struck yet. She thought of the candle going soft in her fingers outside that study door, the moment she'd realized exactly how alone she actually was. She was not alone anymore, and she was done being afraid of men who only knew how to win through other people's silence. Then we don't take the smaller humiliation, she said. We take the fight. Bring it to the council. Let him explain, in front of witnesses he can't intimidate, exactly why a magistrate's clerk has been falsifying inheritance accounts, and exactly what he meant when he told my stepmother that no one questions a grieving woman who wanders off a cliff path at night. Something flickered across Orion's face. Not surprise, she thought, but something closer to approval, maybe even respect. The particular look of a man recalibrating once again just how much steel was buried beneath the composed exterior she'd carried into his study 11 days ago. "You heard him say that?" Orion said slowly. "Specifically, those words." "I stood outside that door for almost 10 minutes, Alice said. "I remember every word he said." "Then we don't just defend the marriage at council," Orion said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, something almost like anticipation edged into his voice. Not eagerness for violence, but the focused intent of a man who'd just been handed exactly the opening he needed. "We bring the murder plot forward ourselves, on our terms, before he can frame the narrative as a grieving woman's confusion. We make him answer for what he actually said, in a room he can't control, in front of people whose verdict he can't buy his way around." Alice felt something settle inside her then. Not peace, not yet, but the particular steadiness that came from finally being allowed to fight back instead of simply running. "How long before the council can convene?" 3 weeks, Orion said, "which gives us time to gather everything we need. The falsified accounts, anyone willing to testify to what they witnessed in your father's final weeks, anything that turns your word into proof a council can't dismiss." He paused, studying her with that same unhurried attention that had unsettled her the first night, and now, somehow, felt steadying instead. "It also gives your uncle 3 weeks to realize what kind of mistake he's made challenging a marriage instead of simply accepting a loss. Men like that rarely use extra time wisely." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Orion said quietly, "that a man desperate enough to plan his niece's death over inheritance, and reckless enough to threaten litigation when that fails, is a man who will likely try something worse before he risks standing in front of a council with nothing left to lose. We should prepare for that, not just the legal fight, whatever comes before it." Outside, the wind had picked up against the old windows, carrying the first cold bite of a season turning, and Alice understood, with a clarity that settled deep and certain in her chest, that the quiet she'd found in this mountain keep was about to be tested in ways far more dangerous than a letter sealed in wax. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wasn't afraid of that test anymore. She was ready for it. The danger arrived on the 9th night after the letter, and it did not announce itself with words. Alice woke to the smell of smoke. Not the familiar pine and hearth scent that had settled into every corner of the keep over the past 3 weeks, but something sharper, more deliberate, drifting up through the floorboards from somewhere below her room. She was out of bed before she'd fully registered why, pulling a cloak over her nightclothes, moving toward the door on instinct alone, the way her body had learned to move during all those nights in her father's house, when she'd trained herself to wake at the smallest wrongness in the air. The corridor outside was already filling with the low murmur of urgent voices, guards moving past her with quick, controlled steps, and somewhere below, she heard Orion's voice. Not shouting, never shouting, but carrying that particular edge of command that made every other sound in the hallway organize itself around it. She found him in the lower hall, directing 2 guards toward the stables, his expression carved from the same focused stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of urgency. A section of the old grain stores near the eastern wall had caught fire. Deliberately, she understood the moment she saw the look on his face. Because grain stores didn't catch themselves on dry autumn nights without help. "Someone got past the outer fence line," Orion said, when he saw her standing at the bottom of the stairs, refusing to be sent back up, despite the warning clear in his eyes. "A fire set in the grain stores, far enough from the main keep that it wasn't meant to burn us out. Meant to be discovered, meant to be a message. Or a distraction." A distraction from what? The answer came not from Orion, but from one of the returning guards, breathless, his expression grim in the firelight still glowing faintly through the smoke-stained windows. "Your Grace, the Eastern Guard Post. Empty. No sign of a struggle, no blood, just gone. Whoever they were never here to fight the fire. They wanted the eastern gate clear. Alice felt the cold of that settle through her even as the heat of the smoldering grain store still hung thick in the air. The eastern gate. The path that led eventually to her own wing of the keep. The rooms she'd slept in every night for 3 weeks, believing herself finally safe. Orion's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, Alice saw something close to barely contained fury flicker behind his composed exterior. Not directed at her, but at the realization settling over both of them at once. This hadn't been an act of desperate, clumsy rage. It had been planned, coordinated, a fire to draw guards toward one side of the keep while someone moved, quiet and unseen, toward the other. "They came for me," Alice said quietly. It wasn't a question. "They came for you," Orion confirmed, and the words landed heavier than she expected. Not because they surprised her, but because some small, exhausted part of her had allowed herself to believe, these past few weeks, that the mountain's isolation might actually be enough to keep her safe without a fight. "Your uncle's letter wasn't a bluff about litigation. It was cover. He needed us distracted with a legal threat while he arranged something far less patient." They searched the keep through the rest of the night. Every corridor, every unused room, every shadow that might have concealed an intruder who'd slipped through during the chaos of the fire. They found nothing. Whoever had come for her had either lost their nerve when the fire failed to draw enough guards away, or had simply been a scout themselves, testing the keep's defenses the way the writer had tested the fence line weeks before. It didn't matter which. The message was the same either way. Her uncle had stopped waiting to see whether litigation would work. He was moving toward something more permanent again. The same plan she'd overheard through a closed door weeks ago, simply relocated to a mountain instead of a cliff path. Alice didn't sleep again that night. She sat in the study where she'd first negotiated her own survival, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her, watching the fire Orion had rebuilt in the hearth, and found herself shaking in a way she hadn't allowed since the night she'd overheard her own death being planned. Orion found her there near dawn, and instead of the careful distance he'd maintained since the contract was signed, the respectful space he'd promised her that first night, no expectation, no crowding. He sat in the chair across from her without a word, close enough that the silence between them felt less like distance and more like company. "You're allowed to be afraid," he said finally, when the quiet had stretched long enough that she'd started to believe he wouldn't speak at all. "I've watched you hold this together for 3 weeks, like a woman who's decided fear is a luxury she can't afford. Tonight, you're allowed to put it down for a few hours." Alice felt something crack in her chest at that, not from the words themselves, but from the strange, unfamiliar relief of being told, by someone with no reason to lie to her, that she didn't have to perform strength every waking moment to be taken seriously. "I keep thinking about my father," she admitted, the words coming out rougher than she intended. "He used to say that the worst thing about betrayal isn't the act itself. It's realizing you spent years sitting at a table with people who were already planning your absence and you never saw it. I sat at that table for 9 years, Orion. 9 years of birthdays and dinners and her braiding flowers into my hair. And the entire time, some part of them was already deciding how useful my death would be." "That's not a failure of perception," Orion said quietly. "That's what cruelty depends on. People like your uncle don't survive by being obvious. They survive by being patient enough to wear kindness as a mask for years, waiting for the moment it pays off. You didn't miss something obvious. You trusted people who'd spent a decade perfecting the art of being trusted." "Is that what happened to you?" Alice asked, before she could stop herself, remembering the words he'd said that first night. "Family who smiled at my face and planned around my absence. Before the crown came to you instead of them?" Orion was quiet for a long moment, and Alice thought briefly that she'd overstepped, that whatever lived behind that scar and that contained exhaustion wasn't something he intended to hand to her, even now, even after everything they'd both survived together in these short weeks. But then he spoke, slowly, his voice carrying none of its usual command, something rawer underneath. "My older brother was meant to take this title," he said. "He was the one our father trained for it, groomed for it, loved openly in a way he never managed with me. I was the second son, useful for border defense and little else, as far as anyone in that house was concerned. When the Eastern Wars came, my brother was meant to lead the defense. I was meant to support him. Somewhere in the planning, someone decided it would be more convenient if only one of us came back from that campaign. And convenient, apparently, if it wasn't him." Alice's breath caught. "Someone in your own family arranged for you to die in that war instead of him." "My father's closest advisor," Orion said, acting, I later learned, on a quiet word from my own uncle, who'd grown tired of watching the title pass through a line he felt entitled to himself. "I survived the ambush they arranged. My brother didn't, because he insisted on riding to pull me out when the position collapsed, and the very loyalty meant to be exploited against me ended up costing him his life instead." His voice had gone very flat, very controlled, the sound of old grief that had been worn smooth by years of forcing it into something manageable. "I came home from that war, a king nobody had planned for, carrying a brother's death that was meant to be mine, in a house full of people who'd hoped for a very different outcome. I dismissed the advisor. I dismissed most of the court that had known and said nothing. And then I stopped trusting rooms full of people who smiled at me, because I'd learned exactly how much that smile was worth." The fire popped softly in the silence that followed. Alice understood suddenly, with a clarity that ached, exactly why this man kept no court, exactly why a mountain keep with a skeleton staff felt safer to him than any hall full of allies who might, given the right incentive, decide his absence was convenient too. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "that you carried that alone for so long." "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Orion said, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand that when I say I won't let your uncle finish what he started, it isn't a king performing chivalry for a woman who arrived at his gate with a clever proposal. It's a man who knows exactly what it costs to lose someone to a family's greed, refusing to let it happen twice in the same lifetime if there's anything at all he can do to stop it." Alice felt something shift in her chest then. Not the careful, transactional gratitude she'd carried into this marriage, but something warmer, harder to name, settling quietly into the space where fear had lived only hours before. She didn't reach for him. She didn't need to. The understanding sat between them plainly enough without it. Two people who'd both survived the particular cruelty of family that smiled while planning your absence, finding, against every reasonable expectation, something steady in each other's company. "Then let's make certain he doesn't get the chance to try again," she said. "Whatever it takes to bring this in front of the council faster. I'm done waiting for him to find a better moment." Orion studied her for a long moment, something settling into his expression that looked, for the first time, less like calculation and more like quiet resolve shared between equals. "There's a way to move faster," he said. "It's not gentle, but it's faster. Tell me." "We don't wait for the council to convene on schedule," he said. "We request an emergency session, on the grounds that an attempt was made on your life inside my own territory, which is true, which is documented by my own guard, and which no regional council can ignore without risking the appearance of protecting a man who just tried to murder his niece a second time. It forces his hand before he's ready. It forces the hearing into a room where his composure has had no time to prepare, where the falsified accounts and the overheard conversation and tonight's fire all land in front of the council at once, before he's had the chance to build a cleaner story." Alice felt something steady settle into her spine. Not the fragile composure she'd carried into this study 3 weeks ago, but something forged from everything that had happened since. "Then call the session," she said. Let him explain the fire to a room full of people who can't be bought. Outside, the last of the smoke from the grain stores drifted thin against a sky just beginning to lighten with dawn. And for the first time since the candle had gone soft in her fingers outside her father's study door, Alice felt something that wasn't quite peace, but was close enough to recognize as its beginning, the particular calm of someone no longer waiting to be saved, finally standing ready to fight for everything that was hers. The council hall in the lowland capital had not seen an emergency session in over a decade, and word of it spread faster than the autumn frost. A king who never left his mountain, riding south with an armed escort and a new wife at his side, demanding judgment against a man accused of murder plots, falsified inheritance, and an attack carried out within the king's own territory. By the time Alice climbed the wide stone steps into the hall, the gallery above the council floor was already packed with lowland gentry who hadn't seen this much scandal in a generation. She found her uncle seated at the opposite table, flanked by the clerk whose careful hand had falsified her father's accounts, and beside him, her stepmother, composed, dressed in mourning gray that suddenly looked less like grief and more like costume. None of them had expected the emergency session. None of them had expected, Alice realized, as she watched her uncle's eyes catch on her standing beside Orion, very much alive and very much beyond his reach, that she would be the one walking into this hall with evidence instead of fear. The council magistrate, an older woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theater, called the session to order, and the testimony began. Orion spoke first, presenting the guard's account of the fire at the eastern wall, the empty guard post, the deliberate timing that left no question this had been coordinated, rather than incidental. Then came the falsified accounts themselves, retrieved from her father's locked drawer and verified by an independent clerk Orion had brought specifically because he answered to no one in the room. And then finally, Alice rose to speak. She did not cry. She had promised herself that on the second night of her ride north, and she kept that promise now, standing straight in front of a gallery full of strangers, repeating word for word what she had heard through her father's study door. 3 weeks until the will reads properly. No one questions a grieving woman who wanders off a cliff path at night. Her voice steady, even as she watched her uncle's composure finally, visibly, begin to fracture. He tried briefly to claim she'd misheard, that grief had distorted her memory, that a niece consumed by sorrow might easily invent conspiracy where none existed. But the falsified accounts spoke for themselves under examination, numbers that didn't match her father's known holdings, signatures forged in a hand the independent clerk identified within minutes as belonging to the man seated beside him, and when the magistrate asked, directly, why an empty guard post at the king's eastern gate happened to align precisely with a fire set in the grain stores the same night, her uncle had no answer that didn't sound like exactly what it was. The clerk broke first, as men who build conspiracies on borrowed courage usually do, offering testimony against her uncle in exchange for leniency, confirming the falsified accounts, confirming the conversation about disposing of Alice quietly, confirming that the plan had always been murder, dressed as accident, long before litigation was ever considered as a backup. By the time the council retired to deliberate, the gallery above had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that meant everyone present already knew which way the verdict would fall. The judgment came within the hour. Her uncle was stripped of any remaining claim to her father's estate, permanently barred from the Western Valley lands, and sentenced to imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder. A sentence the magistrate delivered without a flicker of sympathy for a man who'd spent his testimony trying to paint a grieving woman as unstable, rather than simply admit what he'd done. Her stepmother, found to have known and said nothing while encouraging the plan from the shadows, was exiled from the territory entirely, her name struck from any future claim to anything connected to the family she'd married into for exactly this kind of opportunity. The clerk, for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence, though his career within any regional court was finished the moment his forgery became public record. Alice watched it all from beside Orion, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something settle in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't fear. Something closer to a door closing cleanly, finally, on a part of her life that had nearly ended her. She did not feel triumphant exactly. There was no joy in watching people she'd once called family stripped of everything they'd schemed for. But there was relief, clean and complete, in knowing that the danger was finished, that she would not spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder for a man patient enough to try again. They rode back north together 3 days later, and the mountain keep that had once felt like the edge of the world to her now felt, simply, like home. In the weeks that followed, Alice found herself spending more time in the study where she'd first negotiated her own survival. Not out of necessity now, but because Orion had begun bringing her into conversations about the territory's affairs, asking her opinion on matters of trade and border management, with a seriousness she'd never once been offered in her uncle's house. She found she had a mind for it, sharp and practical, and Orion seemed neither surprised nor threatened by that, only, increasingly, glad of the company. The careful distance he'd promised her that first night slowly became something else, not through any single dramatic moment, but through months of small accumulating proof, the way he remembered, without being told, that she preferred her tea without honey, the way he'd taught the household staff to knock twice before entering her study, after she'd mentioned once, in passing, how unsettling sudden footsteps still felt to her sometimes, the way he never once asked her to perform gratitude for any of it, simply did the small considerate things, and let her notice them in her own time. One evening, nearly 6 months after she'd first ridden through his gates, soaked and exhausted with a death sentence at her back, Alice found him in the study late, the way she often did now, both of them drawn to the same quiet room out of habit rather than necessity. "I used to think," she said, settling into the chair that had become, without either of them deciding it formally, simply hers, "that I came here because it was the only safe option left. A transaction. The smartest move on a board with very few pieces remaining." "And now?" Orion asked, looking up from the ledger he'd been reviewing. "Now I think I came here because some part of me recognized, even exhausted and terrified, that you were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw someone worth protecting rather than someone worth using." She met his eyes steadily, the same steadiness she'd carried into this room the very first night, though it meant something entirely different now. "I didn't expect to find anything real here. I'm glad I was wrong." Orion set the ledger aside, and the look he gave her then carried none of the careful, contained distance of their first weeks together. Something warmer instead, something that had been building quietly in the space between negotiated safety and genuine trust, until it had simply become impossible to call it anything but what it was. "I made you a promise that first night," he said, "that I wouldn't ask for anything beyond the contract unless it was offered freely." "I remember." "I'm not asking now either," he said quietly. "I'm simply telling you that whatever this has become, between the two of us, in this quiet mountain neither of us expected to share. I'm glad of it, whatever you choose to call it, whatever pace you need it to take. I'm not in any hurry, Alice. I've waited 3 years for company I actually wanted in this house. I can wait a little longer for the rest if that's what you need." Alice felt something settle deep in her chest, warm and certain, the particular peace of finally arriving somewhere after a very long journey. "I don't think I need to wait any longer," she said. "I think I've known for a while now. I was simply waiting to be brave enough to say it without fear changing the answer." She reached across the space between their chairs, and he met her hand halfway, and neither of them said anything else for a long while, because some things finally arrived at after so much betrayal and so much careful rebuilding didn't need to be explained with words at all. The story the lowland villages told afterward in the years that followed was simpler than the truth had been. A beautiful woman who rode alone to a lonely king's gate and asked him to marry her, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found something real waiting on the other side of that desperate gamble. They left out the falsified accounts, the conspiracy hearing, the fire in the grain stores. They kept only the part that mattered most in the retelling, that Alice had arrived at that mountain with nothing but a dead man's deed papers and a blade meant for skinning game, and had left it eventually, as something the entire territory came to call simply the king's wife. Not with reverence exactly, but with something close to it. The particular respect reserved for a woman who'd survived betrayal without losing herself to it. Her father's lands flourished under careful management, the Western Valley's mills running steady, the timber trade expanding under terms Alice herself negotiated with a sharpness that surprised lowland merchants who'd expected a grieving girl, and found instead a woman who knew exactly what her father's legacy was worth and intended to protect it properly. And in the quiet mountain keep that had once felt, to a desperate woman riding through the dark, like the last possible refuge in the world, Alice found something she hadn't dared hope for when she'd first knocked on those iron gates. Not just safety, not just justice finally served, but a life entirely her own, built beside a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. The door that had closed, finally and completely, on her old life never opened again. The one that had opened in its place stayed that way for good.